Greetings and welcome. We are in Junior English, and our job now is to turn to the poetry of Walt Whitman, and more particularly, we're going to pay attention to the preface of that classic work, Leaves of Grass. I'm with you in your hymnals on page 424, 425. I just want to point out a couple of really important things about Whitman that's going to build on comments that I made in an earlier introductory lecture. Whitman is radical poet, you'll recall I said, because of the form of his poetry and the content of his poetry. The form of his poetry, well, he's going to write poems that are going to be what your hymnal there is going to give you as the term free verse. You want to write that down, free verse. Now, if you've ever written poetry that did not rhyme, that did not have some kind of set meter, and as opposed to predictable rhyme and meter, you are following in the path of Walt Whitman. It's really Whitman. It's not that Whitman was the first guy to ever write free verse. It's that Whitman was the guy that made free verse acceptable. When the Norton's people who put together anthologies, put together their college anthology of what they called modern poetry, their first poet in that chronological edition is Walt Whitman. So you can jot it down. He's often considered the father or the beginner of modern poetry, more particularly what we will call free verse. So that by the time we get to study great American and British poet T.S. Eliot, well, we're already going to begin to see the influence of a great poet like Walt Whitman. Notice as well that we're going to have longer lines which almost start to resemble prose, although we are going to see that he was a genius prose stylist when we look at his preface. This thing of cataloging or lists, the anaphora that we've spoken about already when we studied Emily Dickinson, the repetition of phrases or sentences with similar structures or meanings. We're going to see this already in the preface. Diction or word choice is going to be something that we'll talk about as well. His words are directly chosen to create certain kinds of effects, sometimes to shock, as we're going to see right away when we study Song of Myself. And then that funny word that sometimes makes students kind of smile, onomatopoeia. We saw this already with Dickinson. Well, let's just say it out loud, that both Dickinson and Whitman love the sound of language, which is what makes them so important as poets for us. They love to hear the poetry, to hear the words. And so reading this poetry out loud is a very useful tool. Of course, the vocabulary at the bottom of 425 is going to be important. Whitman he's a learned poet. He was not a well-educated poet, but he was a learned poet. That is to say, he read a lot. And so he's going to sometimes use words because he loves words, but he's going to use words that are somewhat maybe new to some of us, and so it will make sense to follow that as well. Let's now turn to page 426, 427. At the very beginning, in 1855, Whitman knew he was trying something very, and here's the word I want you to put in your notes, experimental. He knew it. He knew that what he was doing was somewhat unique. He knew that he was leaving or departing poets like Longfellow, tell me not in mournful numbers, life is but an empty dream, for the soul is dead that slumbers, and things are not what they seem. Na 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 na. Whitman knew, I'm leaving that. Okay, I'm leaving that. I'm no longer doing that kind of form of poetics, with the exception of a poem like "O Captain, My Captain," which, by the way, you can Google and read on your own to see his use of rhythm and rhyme. But he also knew that he was going to wade into some territory where poets had not gone before. Like I said to you before, in terms of content, he is iconoclastic. You'll remember we used that term. He is going to make comments on topics that are very unusual. Whitman is one of the first poets to mention farts in his poetry. Really? Not 8th grade fart jokes like little boys like to tell, but rather the sounds of the body, or the smells of the armpit, or on and on and on it goes. Whitman is a poet that will celebrate the human body, every part of the human body. His comments in poetry are, dude, why does everyone get so offended when you start talking about the different parts of the human body? Everybody's got those parts, and those parts all play their role. Remember, Whitman is very open in his understandings of sexuality. And because of that, he knows right away he's going to become offensive. He's going to offend a number of readers. We mentioned already in an earlier lecture that Herman Melville, the great writer and the great novelist, American novelist of Moby Dick, not interested in some of the things that Whitman had to say. So, because Whitman knows that he's about to offer a volume of poetry that might be offensive, that might offend, that might be perceived as not even poetry. Dude, this isn't poetry. He writes what we call a preface. In other words, at the very beginning of Leaves of Grass, he writes a series of comments about what he's trying to do. Now notice the word "from" at the top of page 426. That's because this essay, poetic essay, actually runs for some time. Now, Whitman was a brilliant prose stylist. He wasn't just a poet. And you get a sense of it as well. This is prose, but it almost reads like poetry. America does not repeal the past or what it has produced under its forms or amid other politics or the idea of castes or the old religions. Notice the ellipsis, accepts the lesson with calmness. Why the ellipsis? Because there's other words in between, and your anthology makers want you to get right to the heart of the matter. Now, as we turn to level 1 and we listen to a professional reading, what we call a close reading, C-L-O-S-E, a close reading of a text means we read it as we're listening to it read to us, and we're paying attention, we're following along. But one of the things we're going to ask is simply this at level 1, and you want to write this question down. What is Whitman's objective or his goal? What is Whitman's objective or his goal? What is he trying to pull off? He's going to tell us right from the start what he wants to do. In a word, he wants to be America's poet. Why? Because he believes that America is someplace significantly special, unique among all nations of the current world or any world that has preceded it. Whitman is going to see America as exclusively unique. There has never been a place like this, Whitman will say. But what is it that makes America so unique? Well, he's going to say some of those things here in this preface. Let's pay attention now. Follow along again. Flow with the reading. Okay, here we go.
From Preface to the 1855 edition of Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. America does not repel the past or what it has produced under its forms or amid other politics or the idea of castes or the old religions. Accepts the lesson with calmness. Is not so impatient as has been supposed that the slough still sticks to opinions and manners and literature, while the life which served its requirements has passed into the new life of the new forms. Perceives that the corpse is slowly born from the eating and sleeping rooms of the house. Perceives that it waits a little while in the door, that it was fittest for its days, that its action has descended to the stalwart and well-shaped heir who approaches, and that he shall be fittest for his days. The Americans of all nations at any time upon the earth have probably the fullest poetical nature. The United States themselves are essentially the greatest poem. In the history of the earth hitherto, the largest and most stirring appear tame and orderly to their ampler largeness and stir. Here at last is something in the doings of man that corresponds with the broadcast doings of the day and night. Here is not merely a nation, but a teeming nation of nations. Here is action, untied from strings necessarily blind to particulars and details, magnificently moving in vast masses. Here is the hospitality, which forever indicates heroes. Here are the ruffs and beards and space and ruggedness and nonchalance that the soul loves. Here, the performance, disdaining the trivial unapproached in the tremendous audacity of its crowds and groupings, and the push of its perspective, spreads with crampless and flowing breadth and showers its prolific and splendid extravagance. One sees it must indeed own the riches of the summer and winter, and need never be bankrupt while corn grows from the ground, or the orchards drop apples, or the bays contain fish, or men beget children upon women.
It's easy, just from this little cutting, to get a sense of what Whitman is saying. But I want to start on page 427 with what he says. The Americans, read it with me, the Americans of all nations at any time upon the earth have probably the fullest poetical nature. The United States themselves are essentially the greatest poem. Whoa! Nobody had said this before 1855. Whitman is the first person, really, to say the United States is the greatest country. Of all countries in the world, the greatest country. Now, of course, you have been raised often hearing language like this. The United States is the greatest nation that's ever existed and ever will exist. You've heard things like that. Where did a topic like that come from? It did not come from Jefferson and Washington. Those guys were just trying to form a nation. It didn't even come from great transcendentalists like Emerson, who wanted to break away from Europe, but did not yet actually visualize what America was about to become. Whitman is the great visionary. He sees America as the greatest nation ever conceived or created. Poetry has to be created. But what makes America so great, he continues. Notice he calls it a nation of nations. Boy, you want to write that one down at level 1 and 2A. A nation of nations. In other words, what makes America great for Whitman is that we are not a nation of one people. We are not a nation of one race. We are not a nation of one religion. And he just goes through the list. We are not a nation of one occupation. We are a nation of peoples who come from all over the world. His word is hospitality. Hospitality. Now, if you are hospitable, do you invite people in or do you throw them out? Right, you invite them in. You are open to them. You are willing to say to them, right, as the Statue of Liberty will say, you're all welcome. That's the point of the Statue of Liberty. And of course, Ellis Island at the time, 1855, we're already getting geared up for what will become the great immigrant migrations into the United States. The key word, of course, is the word united. That is to say, all of these nations arriving from all over the world, from Asia, from Europe, from South and Central America. All of these people are arriving. Now today, of course, this is a huge debate. The whole discussion about immigration, politically speaking, is a huge debate. Whitman was the one that argued, no, you don't understand. The whole nation is a nation of immigrants. Everybody who's here came from some other place. And we all had to find a way to cohabitate. That is what makes us great. That is what makes us the greatest country. Whitman will even argue that the minute we stop seeing America that way, we're no longer a dynamic, the key word here, evolving nation. In other words, we are growing. And Whitman has great optimism about this. We are growing. And in his Leaves of Grass, he's going to celebrate all the different ways that America is a growing nation, an evolving nation. We are growing politically, we are growing religiously, we are growing economically, and on and on and on it goes, right? And Whitman wants to be the poet who celebrates all of that, okay? So he's going to turn in his Leaves of Grass to begin to tell that story. But he realizes after he publishes in 1855, he realizes that he will not be able to tell the whole story in his first edition. And so he'll come again a few years later with a new edition. But he still calls it Leaves of Grass. And then he'll re-release, again calling it Leaves of Grass. And in 1892, you have what we call the deathbed edition. That is to say, the last time that he released his poetry. And by that point, this volume that started out really slender has grown to be a pretty good-sized collection of poems. You can, of course, today purchase, for virtually nothing, a decent copy of the deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass. And you can kind of see from the table of contents that there are sections where you will have then a certain number of poems. Like, for example, Drum Taps is his collection of poems from the American Civil War. So, for example, if you want to know about what his views were about the death of President Kennedy and the American Civil War, you will go to that area of Leaves of Grass, all the way to the very end, in chronological order, so that the very last poem, Farewell My Fancy, is going to be the last poem that he ever wrote, where he says goodbye to the thing he loves the most. Two things: his country and his poems. For him, they are symbiotic. He will say, I could not write my poetry if I had not been an American. So let's just say it out loud. Whitman is America's greatest poet. He declares himself as much. Not so much because Whitman says, look at me, I'm such a great poet, but rather, look at me because I'm an American. And what is an American? An American is a person that has all of the blood of all of the nations flowing through it. Not me, I am a totally white person. Whitman will say, no, you don't understand. We're not talking about just your physical blood. We're talking about your spiritual, your cultural blood. We're talking about the way you think about yourself. Whitman imagines a time when there will be no racism, because all American children will play on a playground together and never see color, never see religion, never see politics. It is interesting to ask the question, if 1855 is the year he writes these words, 100 years later was what? 1955. Of course, 1955 is just a few years before most of you were born, if you'll think about that. And 1955 is, of course, the beginnings of what we call the Civil Rights Movement. What was the Civil Rights Movement in America? The right for minorities to be considered politically equal. 100 years after Whitman writes these words, we're still having that struggle in America? We are. And of course, Martin Luther King Jr. will often hark back to the poetics and the language of a Walt Whitman to say, Whitman was way ahead of his time when he said, we are a nation of nations. And we must always remember that. There cannot be racism because there is no differences fundamentally, because we're all Americans. Even though we all claim different kind of cultural heritage. That's what makes us so great. This is why Whitman will be such an ardent abolitionist. He will say, we cannot own slaves. We have to be a nation of freedom. We cannot have bias and prejudice against other people because we are a nation of liberty. Go back and look at our founding documents, he will say. And all of those documents point to what truth? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And that's the final word, the word equal. The egalitarian nature of Whitman's poetry is going to be straight in your face. We are all in this together. Of course, what's the greatest symbol for Whitman to teach this to us? Grass. Grass. It's everywhere. Doesn't matter where you go. What's fascinating about it is that you don't have to plant it. It plants itself. Who planted all the grass in the Badlands? Well, no, you don't understand. No, it's out there. It's all over the place. Like, who planted all that grass? Did somebody like, man, they must have been working hard and watering it? No. But dude, that's a desert. You can't have grass in the middle of desert. How does the grass get there? Whitman will point out, that's the best symbol of America because it grows everywhere. Let's now turn in a second to Leaves of Grass, now that we've taken a look at the preface, and let's see what Whitman himself has to say in his classic text, Song of Myself.